former Fulton County District Attorney and Sheriff.
Formerly a judge, and he knows a little bit about how these things go.
From Mohawk Valley, legal eagle, lawman.
He is the Sheriff of Fulton County, New York. Just such an amazing guy.
This is the Rich Giardino Show, where the Constitution, crime, and politics meet.
Welcome to the Rich Giardino Show, where the Constitution, crime, and politics meet. I'm your host, Rich Giardino. Tonight we have a very interesting guest, John Lott. John is a PhD and has master's, and John is a nationally recognized economist. He worked for the government in the Sentencing Commission early on in his career. He's taught at several colleges and universities. He's written hundreds of articles, and he's lectured across this country. There's been times when they've tried to silence John, I call you Professor Lott, when they've tried to silence Professor Lott for some of his papers and some of his opinions. However, many of them you'll find after listening, you're going to want to adopt and do your own research, and I hope that's what we do. So welcome, John. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to be with us today. What caught my eye was your recent article on law enforcement collapse, mass rising crime rates. Can you talk a little bit about the commentary that you recently wrote and how it interplays into what's going on in this country today?
Right. Well, a lot of the media, you'll see headlines that crime is falling, but people mistakenly think that it's increasing. And I think the media either doesn't understand the statistics or is purposely misleading people, whatever. But I think people are right about the increased crime. What people need to understand is that there are two different measures that the Department of Justice has of crime. They have data on reported crime that the FBI collects from police departments around the country. And then they have something called the National Crime Victimization Survey from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And the goal of that is to try to get a hold of what's happening to total crime, both reported and unreported. And in the past, prior to 2020, those two numbers generally went up and down together. But since 2020, they've been going in opposite directions each year, and often by very large amounts. So you look at 2022, for example, while the FBI claimed that there was a 2% drop in reported crime to the police, the Bureau of Justice Statistics indicates that there was a 42% increase in violent crime that occurred that year. And, there are multiple reasons for that, but you touched on one, and that is we've seen a collapse in law enforcement. If people want to use the FBI data, just looking at that, what you see is that in the 5 years prior to COVID, in large cities, about 44% of reported violent crimes result in arrest. By 2022, they had fallen to 20%. That's over a 50% drop in arrest rates for violent crime. The drop in arrest rates for reported property crime was even larger at 65%. We've never seen such low arrest rates for reported violent and reported property crimes. Nothing even remotely close to that ever in the FBI data. And the thing is, if you look at arrests as a percentage of total crimes, it's even worse. So only about 8% of total violent crimes result in arrest in those cities, and only about 1% of total property crimes in those cities result in arrest. And as I'm sure many people know, in many of those large cities, an arrest doesn't mean that the person's going to be charged, let alone prosecuted or convicted. And so, I don't know how else to describe it, but if you're talking about less than a 1% chance that a criminal who commits a property crime is going to end up getting punished, it looks to me basically like crime, law enforcement's collapsed in this country. And it's not too surprising that if criminals don't face much of a risk anymore of getting caught and punished for committing crime, you're going to see more crime. And so you've seen this collapse in law enforcement and punishment, and you've seen a big increase that's occurred over the same time in crime rates.
I think the public should be aware that we often, and you economists probably, and we in the criminal justice field refer to closure rates or clearance rates. So clearance
Right,
rate is
that's
if you had 100 crimes and 50
arrest.
get arrested, that's called the clearance rate. What happens to them
Right.
afterward is part of the system. But two things I wanted to discuss with you. Even the FBI, they hide it. They have it on their website. In 2020, 2021, they shifted to NIBRS, which is a
Right.
national incident-based reporting system.
In
But all
2021, they
along,
shifted.
what year?
Right. In
21.
2021, they shifted.
Yeah. So what we know from that is in 2022, only a third or almost a third.
31% didn't report any data to the FBI, and another 24% only partially reported. So
Yeah.
you compare that to 2020, for example. That's the reason why I was correcting you. 2020, 97% of police departments were reporting crime data to the FBI. 10% of those were only partially reporting. But you compare that to 2022, where you had less than half of police departments reporting complete data to the FBI. Now, they don't put zeros in for those non-reporting places. They try to guess what they think they are. But, I would argue that they're not doing a very good job, but it surely adds a lot more noise to the FBI measure of that than would have been the case previously. But look, the Bureau of Justice Statistics numbers are kind of considered the gold standard, because if you're going to go and ask people, do you care about crimes that are reported to police, or do you care about crime, total crime? And most people would think that they care about total crime that's there. And the problem also is that we've known for a long time that if people don't believe that the criminals are going to be caught or punished, they're just less likely to go and report those data to the police. They're not going to go and call them up. And in parts of this country, it's gotten even worse in the sense that you call up 911 and the person on the other line will ask you if it's an emergency. By that, they mean, is the criminal there right now committing the crime? And if you tell them no, then they'll say, well, you can come down to the police station and a report will be filled out. That's different from what it was a few years ago. A few years ago, they would have sent out a police car to go and take a report. And the thing you have to understand is that if you make it more difficult, more time consuming for somebody to go and report a crime, you're going to have some people who are going to say, it's just not worth it for me to go and do it. And so they're not going to report a crime. Now, it's not just that total crimes are differing from the FBI's measure of reported crimes. Even the National Crime Victimization data of reported crimes has now, since 2020, been going in opposite directions of the FBI's measure of reported crimes. So in 2022, while the FBI showed a 2% drop in reported violent crimes, the National Crime Victimization data showed a 29% increase in reported crimes. And part of that, I think, is on this last point that we've both been talking about, and that is what you see is that people, I think, believe that if you call up 911, that counts as reporting a crime. And so, but as far as the FBI data is concerned, it only counts if a police report has been filled out on it. And so what's happened is that you have had some people call up 911, but decide it's just not worth it to go down to the police station. And then when they get the National Crime Victimization Survey, what happens is they get asked their 40 questions about where the crime occurred, when it occurred, what it involved, who was involved, what was the outcome. And then at the end, they'll ask them if they reported the crime, and they'll say, yes, they reported the crime, but that's because they called up 911 and told them, whereas no police report was filled out. And then on top of that, another problem that you have is that, a lot of these major cities, we have Soros prosecutors, they're refusing to prosecute people for these crimes. So, in Manhattan, in New York City, Alvin Bragg has reduced 60% of the felonies, most of them from felonies to misdemeanors. And overwhelmingly, the cases involve aggravated assaults. One thing that makes a difference, as I'm sure you know, between an aggravated assault and a simple assault is whether a weapon was used. And Alvin Bragg is refusing to prosecute people for firearms offenses. And so you end up with a situation where somebody committed an aggravated assault with a gun, but the prosecutors are refusing to include the gun in the charges that are there. And what happens is that pressure gets put onto the police, because the police know that the prosecutors will yell at them if they include a weapon in their report, because the prosecutors don't want to take the hit for reducing all the crimes from an aggravated assault to a simple assault. And so they basically put pressure on the police not to include the weapon in their initial charges that are there. And so what happens is that while the police reports don't include a weapon, then when the people get interviewed by the National Crime Victimization people, what happens is they're asked about the crime. They tell them that they've been assaulted, and they told them that a weapon was used, a gun was used. And so the National Crime Victimization Survey classifies that as an aggravated assault, even though the police reports counted that as only a simple assault. The reason why that's important is that the FBI violent crime data is only counting aggravated assaults and not simple assaults that are there. So it's just another reason why even the measures of reported crime between the FBI and the National Crime Victimization data are also out of whack over the last few years.
The problem is some of it's intentional and some of it is the system. We constantly, where the boots, rubber meets the road, we're constantly getting notes from neighbors saying, hey, this isn't entered properly. You got to change this. You got to change that. So it becomes frustrating for small agencies to do the catch up. And one thing I did want to state is in June or May of 2024, the FBI said that 25 of the largest police agencies that cover over 250,000 people in their communities had not reported their crime statistics, meaning that over 6 million victims, or not potential victims, let me say, didn't have a say in didn't have their information forwarded. So it's a game that they're playing that comes with defunding the police, with modifying what the police do, and they're really hurting the communities, the lower income, the minority communities who need policing. And one thing that used to frustrate me, I was an elected judge before a sheriff and elected DA, and I taught college for 30 years as an adjunct at a law school and at a community college. And one thing that frustrated me was they never give you the full data on what's going on. Even back then, even when I taught a few years ago, I stopped teaching when I became the sheriff. But it's frustrating because the public, a lot of people, they use the phrase they, and I say they, I mean those who oppose criminal justice or those who want reforms, they use the phrase over-policing communities. And law enforcement is always policed to the levels of crime in the community. So we don't go in and pick a community. Let's go swamp this community. We send
put the police
cars
where the crimes are.
Yeah, where the crimes are. Very frustrating. I did want to tell you another statistic that's very upsetting to me. And I had called. We'll talk about guns a little bit now. But I actually called one of the website administrators of a gun violence archive. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Last year, they started reporting suicides, and I always start out my talks with classes and my talks to the gun rights people that over 50% of the deaths and injuries from guns, whether handguns, rifles, shotguns, are suicides and attempted suicides. So they took out the suicides this year. And last year they haven't reported them. And they said, well, we can't get accurate records on suicides. I said, well, the last 15 years you had accurate records on suicides. And even those are skewed because you don't know if an accident was a suicide. You don't know, so sometimes an accident.
Well, I mean, there's pressure often from relatives or whatever to classify suicide as an accidental discharge or something like that, for everything from insurance to other issues, just shame. So there's I know of cases where people have lobbied local coroners to
Well,
get
this,
something changed from a suicide to an accident.
yeah, I've seen that happen, and I mean, I'm aware that that happens.
But
It's
I have to say, the
frustrating.
gun violence archive people are a real piece of work. They rely on news reports, often initial news reports on cases, which frequently get things wrong that are there. But a little while ago, the Gun Violence Archive was caught lobbying the Centers for Disease Control to remove data from the CDC website on defensive gun uses, because the head of the Gun Violence Archive argued that having the CDC put out that type of data was making it more difficult for them to go and lobby for the types of gun control laws that they wanted to have. And so that's just simply inappropriate for somebody to suggest, and for the Centers for Disease Control to determine what data should be included based on whether it made it more or less difficult to go and lobby for gun control laws. That shouldn't be the criteria whether to include information or not.
I think one of the things that I was going to mention to you as well is that we have a system that, in addition to not reporting everything accurately, there's no one to hold them accountable. You know, you and I aren't going to hold them accountable. One thing I'd like to talk about, I used to use your book, More Guns, Less Crime, in all my criminal justice classes. So you know how long that goes back. When was your first edition of that?
1998.
So I started using it in 98. I started teaching in 86. And I started using it when it came out. It was one of the required readings. And what they did was and I'm not saying everybody, but a lot of the liberals, a lot of the reformers attacked you on your data. However, other economists and other research institutes said that it was accurate. But the one thing I know that everyone agreed to is that, based on your research, is more guns don't create more crime. So at least they went that far. So while they say more guns doesn't mean less crime, they went as far as to say, well, more guns doesn't make more crime. So they gave you credit, but backhandedly. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, what is not reported when we talk about gun violence is, or the appropriate use of guns to defend oneself, right? What isn't reported is if somebody brandishes a gun and they never call the police and the crime is interrupted because of it. So how do you get accurate numbers on those, or where do you go for reliability on when people use it? I know that the NRA publishes man shoots robber.
Right.
You
Well,
know,
they
but
only have a few cases that the NRA focuses on each month. But look, how do we know that most crimes aren't reported to police? Well, we know that through things like the National Crime Victimization Survey, where they go and they survey people, asking them if they've been a victim of a crime. And then we can compare that to the rate that people actually report crimes to the police. And so you basically do a survey similar to that, and lots of surveys have been done on the rate of defensive gun uses. And what you find basically is about 95% of defensive gun uses aren't reported to police, which isn't too surprising. Look, we did a deep dive on media coverage of defensive gun uses a couple years ago. We went through all the news stories that we could find during 2021. And what we found was that if you look at the several thousand news stories on defensive gun uses across the country, most of those involve instances where the attacker was killed, over half. About 42% of them involve instances where the attacker was wounded, and only about 4% of them involve brandishing. And most of those involved cases where the attacker was held at gunpoint until the police arrived. The point is that what happens in reality isn't necessarily reflected by what's newsworthy. If you're editor of a news bureau and you have two stories that come across your desk, in one case there's a dead body on the ground, In another case, let's say a woman brandishes a gun, the would-be attacker runs away, no shots are fired, nobody hurt, you're not even sure what crime would have been committed. If you're editor of a news bureau, which story are you going to have in your paper? Is it going to be the case where there's a dead body on the ground? Or is it going to be a case where brandishing resulted in a crime not ever occurring, and you're not even sure what crime would have taken place? I think anybody, if I was editor of a news bureau, and I suspect you or others, would have picked the dead body on the ground as being more newsworthy. You know, it's the whole thing of if it bleeds, it leads. Exactly.
Yeah.
And
I will tell you this, as a judge, what was frustrating to me is they don't have a checkbox on a police report. We don't know when somebody's in front of me on a gun crime, when they shot somebody, robbed somebody, murdered somebody, right? We don't see how many of those guns are illegally possessed. Obviously, if they have prior felonies, they can't possess them. So here's an interesting thing. I went to a national conference and they had the FBI statisticians and DCJS talking about, or Department of Justice talking about, you know, how the numbers are so great, things are going well, we got these task forces, everything's good. And I said, you have an accurate record on those people who committing crimes with firearms, the guns are legally possessed or illegally possessed? Not really yet. We're working on it. And I did the same with the state. We had a state conference and I asked
right,
DCJS the same question, the same response. Well, we don't have that data. And I said, well, wouldn't that data be important to come up with a good policy if you knew if the people who are possessing the guns are illegally possessing them or legally possessing them? In fact, I've seen studies, and maybe you can enlighten me. I saw one study that said 1/6 of 1% of lawful handgun owners will use it in a crime. 1/6 of 1%. I don't know. That seemed awful small, but when I was a judge, I was responsible for revoking and suspending pistol permits. And in 19 years of being a judge, there was less than a dozen people who had lawful handguns that I had to suspend or revoke because they used them in a crime. Most of it was
right.
DWI or other things, but
Sure.
in a crime,
Well,
it was actually
there's a
smaller.
little bit I can say on the points that you're raising. And the first one is about 90% of people, murderers, had violent criminal records. So it means that it's unlawful for
Yeah,
them to have owned a
yeah.
gun to begin with. Okay. And so that's one thing. And then the second point was, see if I remember. Oh yeah, the rate that law-abiding citizens. So we have, I don't know, 350, 450, 400 million guns in the United States. You look any given year, you're talking about 250,000 gun crimes that are committed. So, I mean, you get some idea of what fraction of 1%. Now, obviously, some guns are used in multiple crimes, okay? And so, you know, let's say every gun is used on average in 2 crimes. That may be an underestimate. Every crime gun, you know, so you're dividing 400 million by, you know, 125,000 or something like that. And then on top of that, you have to take into account that, you know, even if it's not used this year, it may be used in some future year in a crime. But, you know, even over time, you're still talking about something that's a tiny fraction of 1%, you know, maybe less than 0.5%. So I don't know if it's a 1/6 of 1%, but, you know, you just go and do some simple calculations like that, and it's pretty clear that it's less than 0.5%.
I do want to hit one more area and then ask you a general question. School violence and school safety. After Columbine, until Columbine, there were a few incidents, but it was not on the proportion that it's at now, where you can, as soon as school starts, there's a shooting the first day or the second day. I've struggled as a former DA, as a sheriff, and as a former judge. I've struggled on what steps we can take to make it safer for schools and children in schools. Because one
Right,
death is one too many. And one of the things, some of the things I do agree with, like I do agree that mental health is a big part of it. I do agree with charging the parents when they know their kid's been a suspect in making threats and then giving them a gun for Christmas. I do believe, I mean, they'll have their day in court, they're innocent until
well,
proven
here's
guilty.
right. Well, let me just you're listing a lot of points. Let me just deal with the last point, and then we'll go to the other two that you just mentioned. And that is, you know, the FBI interviewed this young man a year ago, okay, over a year ago. Apparently, the claim is he had made threats. Making threats to go and kill people is a crime, right? And the FBI didn't arrest him, okay? The FBI didn't charge him. Why didn't they charge him? Is it because they couldn't prove that he was the one who had made the threats that were there? You know, you go through half of the mass public shooters over the last 25 years were actually seeing mental health care professionals prior to their attacks. In not one single case did the mental health care professionals identify any of those individuals as a threat to themselves or others. And so my question is, if the FBI doesn't charge the guy, if the FBI doesn't take them in, I mean, there are lots of things that the FBI could have done, even not even charging with the crime. The FBI could have used the civil commitment type rules that exist in Georgia, for example. They could have, you know, where you would have been taken in for a mental health care evaluation, which they didn't do. If the mental health care in New York has these laws, every state has these laws. If the mental health care professionals believe that there was, quote, a reasonable chance that the person was a danger to themselves, which is like a 20% chance or so, then there could have been an immediate hearing. And if, you know, evidence would have been provided, if a lawyer couldn't be afforded, one would be provided for them. And the thing is, if the judge had found that the person was a danger to themselves or others, and it varies by state what level of proof they need to have to do that, the judge is a former judge, I'm sure you know, has a wide range of options. The judge could have said, look, if you go and keep on seeing mental health care professionals regularly, we'll have you come back in a week or two and we'll reevaluate the situation. They could take away the person's guns. They could take away their driver's license if they think they're going to drive a car through a crowd someplace. Or in the most extreme, if they really believe that the person is a danger to others, they could involuntarily commit the person that's there. The FBI didn't do any of those things, okay? And the question is, why? And if, let's say the FBI, I don't know, because we don't know yet, but let's say the FBI didn't feel that they could prove it, okay? They thought maybe he was the person who made the threats, but they weren't sure. You know, who knows if the father asked his son, then, okay, did you do this or not? And he told the father the same thing that he had told the FBI, that no, he hadn't done it. But my only question is, why is it the parents? You know, if you are going to have a situation where these mental health care professionals can't identify these individuals, okay, or law enforcement, I mean, you know, apparently the mom called up the school that morning saying that she was worried. School didn't act on it when they were given. So whose fault is it? Is it the parents, or is it the law enforcement? Is it the mental health experts that are there? You know, and presumably if there was this information, I suspect at the time the school was told about it, okay, what did the school do about it? Why, I understand the desire to try to hold somebody responsible, but why is it the parents that should be going to jail?
I'll give you a couple thoughts of my own on that. Number one, our mental health system is overworked and low resources. In New York State, what would happen is the FBI would call my office and say, we got a complaint or a computer thing came over. There's a person in your community. This is the guy's name and address, or this is the kid's name and address. We would then dispatch a deputy to talk to the
Right.
family, father. If enough red flags were raised, we would ask for what's an emergency risk protective order to seize the weapons. And I got hundreds of guns in my lockup. I've been threatened on an FBI hotline and on a state hotline by somebody who blamed me because they lost custody of their child, and we had served him eviction. Once he got evicted, he couldn't have visitation. He couldn't live. He was living in his car, and so I used to be a opponent of some of the red flag measures because there's no psychological exam in our state.
Right. You don't,
You or me can
well,
say,
the only
"Oh, I
thing
have
you can do,
Yep.
exactly, the only thing you can do with red flag is take away a person's guns. And
Mhm.
if the vast majority of times that red flag laws are used in cases where you're concerned about suicide, if somebody's really suicidal, is it really a serious response just to take away their guns? You're telling me that there's no other way that the person can commit suicide? You're telling me, I mean, it's just not a serious response. As you say, there's no mental health professional there. You have civil commitment laws in New York. So that here's the difference, is that if you're really concerned about somebody, put them through the civil commitments. First of all, I mean, I know of situations where the red flag laws have been abused. I have a friend in Oregon, for example, his name Andrew Pollock. He lost his daughter at Parkland when he had to leave Florida because of all the memories of his daughter. And he moved all the way across the country to rural Oregon. He had two people move in next door to him from California who just hated him politically. And after a property lines dispute that was there, they put in an extreme risk protection order, which the judge granted because they had a written complaint that's all the judge saw. It turns out when they finally did have the hearing, the judge didn't even require that Andy had to put on a defense because he said, there's no threat here. Why did you file this? And as soon as that case was taken care of, the neighbors got two other neighbors to file extreme risk protection orders against him. And during that time when he had his guns, and they lost those too in similar ways, he ended up getting arrested because he had violated the first extreme risk protection order because he accidentally was in the same parking lot as the person who had brought the extreme risk protection order. And the judge threw that out when, you know, he had to go to court for violating that order that was there. And he spent literally hundreds of thousands of dollars on his legal defenses there. He's gone through these extreme risk protection orders 3 times that are there. And it's just because people hated him politically. And the thing is, all the judge sees when he makes a decision on this is the written complaint. Whereas with the civil commitments, and so you can't blame the judge, okay? But if you had civil commitment, what would happen is there'd be a hearing and people could go and provide evidence on the other side on whether or not there's true. As if they had that original hearing, as the judge said, there's no threat here. Why did you even file this to begin with? And so, but he almost got in a lot of trouble because he lives in rural Oregon. There are lions and bears and other things. Outside his home one day, he normally would carry his handgun with him for protection. But there was a mountain lion that was there that he ran into. Fortunately, he had his dog with him. The dog got into a fight with the mountain lion, had to have 50 stitches on its side, ended up living, but it ended up protecting him and making it so he was able to get inside the house, before the mountain lion could get at him. But he was disarmed because of these bogus extreme risk protection orders. You know, most of the time when people, I mean, you were a judge, most of these times when people go through the extreme risk protection or red flag things, they don't even hire a lawyer in their cases. And the reason is because once in New York, I'm sure this is the case as in these other states, no lawyers provided for you in those cases. You've been in law, you know, it can cost like $10,000 to go and hire a lawyer for an extreme risk protection order hearing.
You're depriving them of one of their constitutional rights. So you would think that because we give everyone else lawyers for everything, including illegal immigrants, maybe we would give somebody those.
I agree.
The reason because I do believe that red flags laws, after being threatened, makes you change your opinion. I do believe they have some purpose. I do agree with you, though. There should be a psychological evaluation and mental health testimony, not a neighbor saying, I don't like him. He looked at me cross-eyed.
Well, so how would that be different from a civil commitment then?
That would be the same, but ours doesn't require psychological testimony.
Well, none of the red flag laws do.
Yeah.
And
So,
so I would just say, if you want to, why not go and make some changes to the existing civil commitment laws if you think something needs to be changed on it? The
Yeah.
reason why they don't want to go and deal with the civil commitment laws is they want the entire focus to be on guns, as opposed to the mental health aspects and the fact that somebody can commit suicide or do other things with other weapons that are there. And so, I would just say, look, if you think that there should be mental health care evaluation, if you think that there should be, and there can be an immediate hearing in the civil commitment type case, go and do that. Why do we need red flag laws? As we've said, both of us have said multiple times, the only thing that happens is you take away somebody's guns. If you really think that somebody's a danger to themselves or others, is simply taking away their legally owned guns going to stop them from doing that type of harm? And I
Do
just don't
anything
think
they
that's
can
a
use-
serious response.
what do you think we could do? Because you and I both agree that a sign that says gun-free zone, there's not one case in this country that anyone can cite that somebody says, I saw the gun-free zone at the school or the movie
Right.
theater, the store, and I turned around and I said, I'm not going to shoot up the place today. What can we do to protect our kids in schools that you think is legitimate? Because mental health, like they try to minimize mental health, but it's a big part of it. They try to minimize, like a lot of times say, oh, mental health is only, no, it's not only 9%. You can talk, all the, like you said, so many of these people have a history that people said along the way, something's wrong with that guy, something's going to happen, something's wrong with that kid. So what do you suggest on all your research and all your knowledge in the field? What can we do to safeguard the children at schools? And I don't want an armed encampment, but I do want to protect them.
Okay, well, the thing is, you bring up the signs, and I'll mention this first, and that is, these gun-free zone signs actually serve as a magnet for these attacks. So take something like the Covenant School shooting last year. In Tennessee, if a law-abiding citizen like myself were to violate the Safe School Zone Act that they had in place at that time, if I carried my permanent concealed handgun onto school property, I would face up to 6 years in prison. That's a huge penalty for me taking my concealed handgun onto school property, even though I have a permit. Okay, my life would be completely changed as a result of having to spend 6 years in prison. But let's say the murderer in this case, who murdered 6 people, had lived, okay, and was going to be facing either 6 death penalties in Tennessee or 6 life sentences. Does anybody really seriously think that the threat of taking 6 years from their 7th life would be the penalty that would cause them not to go and commit the crime? I mean, it's just not serious. There's no marginal penalty that they face. All you've done by setting up these criminal penalties is to make it sure that the only person that would have the gun is the bad person, not the person do it. So what happens is that rather than deterring people, these gun-free zones actually serve as a magnet, because these murderers know that they'll be the only person with a weapon. One thing that just drives me absolutely nuts is the media news coverage refuses to cover the diaries and manifestos, which mention the parts of them that mention why these guys pick the targets that they do. Time after time after time, they explain why they pick the targets that they do. If you look at the Nashville Covenant School shooter, she apparently had looked at 3 other sites to go and do the attack, and it decided not to because, one was a mall. They allowed people to carry concealed handguns there. Other ones were also protected by people with guns. And so she picked the school because nobody was there. From New York, you have the Buffalo mass murder from a couple years ago. He had a manifesto. He spends a great deal of time in his manifesto explaining why he picked the target they do. The New York Times has had like 8 editorials on that case as kind of exhibit A for mass public shootings. Not once do they ever mention that he says he picked the place because he wanted to go to a place where he didn't think any of his victims would be able to go and defend themselves. And so and there are literally dozens of these cases where these murderers explicitly explain that they picked these gun-free zones because, look, most of these guys just want to commit suicide, but they want to get media coverage. And they know that the more people they kill, the more media coverage that they're going to get. And so they know if they go to a place where their victims aren't going to be able to go and defend themselves, they're going to be able to go and kill more people that are there. And so, they're not stupid. You look at the Sandy Hook mass murder. According to police, he had put together what amounted to a doctoral dissertation. He had been planning his attack for over 2.5 years. He had done this large report looking at mass public shootings over the previous 40 years from around the world, and had graphed out, according to one police report, the relationship between the number of people killed and the amount of media coverage that they got. And his goal was to go and kill more people than the Norway killer had killed. He shot to death 67 people that were there. And because he wanted to get even more worldwide news coverage than the Norway killer, who has killed more people in the mass shooting than any mass public shooting in the United States. And so these guys may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid, okay? And so what you have to do is you have to make them believe that somebody with a gun, somebody that they can't identify quickly before their attack, may be able to stop them. So I want to say one thing. So in this Georgia case, we have a school resource officer who stopped the attack, and that's great. The problem is, and I suspect you definitely understand this, somebody in uniform has an incredibly difficult job in stopping one of these attacks. And the reason is because if you know that there's one person there with a gun and they're the person in uniform, they're readily identifiable, okay? It gives huge tactical advantages to the attacker. The attacker can either wait for the uniformed person to leave the area before they attack, or they can move on to another part of the school, if there are multiple school buildings or something, to go and do their attack. Or if they're going to take out one person first, who do you think they take out first? They're going to take out the one person that they know has a gun. And so the advantage of having, let's say, armed teachers or staff is that you take away that tactical advantages. I mean, you have concealed carry in New York, not very much, but you have people who carry concealed. Neighboring Pennsylvania, for example, you have like 14.5% of the adult population with a concealed carry permit. You can go to a mall, you can go to a movie theater, you can go to a restaurant, you can go to a grocery store, and the probability that someone nearby you is carrying is very high. But you would never know because it's concealed. You had no clue who's doing that. And so the thing is, if you were to have a sign in front of the school that says, warning, select teachers and staff at this school are carrying concealed and will go and use their guns to go and protect the students and themselves. Look, we've looked at all the school shootings in the United States from 2000 on, everything from an accidental discharge all the way up to a mass public school shooting. There have been 9 mass public school shootings where 4 more people have been killed since 2000. Not one attack of any size where anybody's been injured or killed has occurred in the 10,000 or so schools that have armed teachers and staff. You have just over 20 states that have allow armed teachers and staff. Georgia's one of them. Unfortunately, only 3 counties in Georgia have actually armed teachers and staff in their schools. And it varies by state. Some states like Utah and New Hampshire, if a teacher has a concealed carry permit, they're automatically allowed to carry there. And you have different rules, like Texas, about 40% of the school districts allow armed teachers and staff to carry. Oklahoma's similar. Ohio was similar up until a state Supreme Court decision that struck down the law, and they're kind of building back up again now. But, the thing is, if they believe somebody's going to be there to stop them and make it more difficult for them to do it, they know they're not going to be able to kill as many people as they want. And that's going to make it so they're not going to get the media coverage that they're going to want to get. And
I agree with them. I agree with you on both points. One, I agree with the movement not to name them. I don't mind not naming the shooter, but I do agree with you that the manifesto should be released. And in New York, we would never get the law allowing teachers to carry. So
Right.
I'm strong supporter of school resource officers. Before we go, because I've kept you on.
Well, here's the thing, just quickly. So if you're going to have school resource officers, please don't put them in uniform, okay? Please have them be like a regular staff person at the school so they're not readily identifiable. I'll give you a question. We have air marshals.
Mhm.
Would you want the air marshals to be in uniform?
Well, that does serve a certain deterrent point, because here's the thing: if they're in uniform and they see the patrol car out front of the school, that automatically deters. There was a kid in Vermont whose grandmother turned him in, who went to the school every day and made notes and was watching. And they had one school officer for 3 schools. He knew the
Right.
guy's schedule. So, but if you don't know it, and there's a school in front, a car in front, we in our state, most of them do wear uniforms. There's a push in some states. I think somewhere in Colorado, maybe out, maybe in Montana where you are. They wear blazers, or they just
Well, they should, but they shouldn't be. Look, again, you have air marshals? Do you want air
Right.
marshals to be in uniform?
No, but let me ask you this: I never read about air marshals stopping any of these fights on board, or these drunks, or anybody. Do you see
Right.
that?
Well, they do happen once in a while, but they are rare.
Yeah.
And you have only a couple percent. But the point was, look, the exact example that you gave about the person trying to figure out what school the person was at. That's exactly the tactical advantages that I was just going through. You wait for the person to leave, okay, or you go and pick where you know the person's not going to be there. If the person's not in uniform, you can't track where the person is. And so what you do is have a sign. A police car is great. I have no problem with the police car in front of the school, but not letting the person know who is the guy who's carrying. So rather than a police car in front of the school, have a sign. A lot of these schools that have allowed teachers and staff to carry have a sign that just says warning, select teachers and staff. So I think it serves, I like the point about the police car, but this essentially does the same thing. If the students can see the police car, they can see the sign that warns them. And so, if you think the police car will deter them from doing the attack, hopefully the sign will do the same thing. And the sign, they have no clue who it is that's carrying.
Yeah, so that's definitely a tactical advantage for the law enforcement. I will tell you that I believe every school district should, and every school should have a school resource officer like any other equipment or tool. We've taken our society and made teachers police officers. They're not police officers, they're teachers. They shouldn't have to put themselves, they do it because of the love of their students and because it's the right thing to do, but we've made it not an appropriate use of why you go to school to be a teacher, that you're going to confront a shooter.
Well, they're
Let
there
me ask you this.
anyway. I'm
Yeah,
not saying that they should be forced to do it, but
no.
if they're, and obviously you have political considerations in New York that you have to deal with, but I'm just saying that, anyway, go ahead.
Let me ask you a question. What website can people go to get more information about you, the Research Institute, and some of your papers to educate themselves?
Well, they can go to crimeresearch.org, crimeresearch.org. So it has all this information that we've been talking about and a lot more.
Okay. I want to thank you very much. Is there anything else that I forgot to ask you that you think is important for our listeners? And again, I've kept you on quite a bit, but I want to give you the opportunity to say,
No,
hey,
no,
this
no.
is
I think I've more than exhausted your time, much more than you originally planned. So anyway, I
well,
appreciate
no,
you having me on.
I have the time. I just didn't want to keep you too long. But I really want to thank you for coming on, because people need to hear, we have so much, they try to silence one side of the arguments, and you've experienced it, and I commend you for not throwing in the towel and saying it's not worth it. Because I've read some of the articles where they've tried to minimize your work because they don't get what your work is about, and your arguments. So, like John Lott, like every other guest I have, you accept what you want to take from his points. You adopt the facts as he presents them. Do your own research, but at least you had
Right.
the opportunity to get it directly from somebody who spent his career, in the field. And I really appreciate that. You've been listening to the Rich Giardino Show. Thank you for listening. This is where the Constitution, crime, and politics meet. Our guest was John Lott, who's an expert in the field of gun violence and gun control and gun research and violence research. And so I really appreciate his time today. Please follow us, like, and share on YouTube, X, Spotify, Apple, and Rumble.
Like and subscribe to The Rich Giardino Show, part of the Elite Influencer Network, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time on The Rich Giardino Show, where the Constitution, crime, and politics meet.